The human animal isn't doing well in the modern world. We have become domesticated and have lost our wildness. The Human Animal Show explores a return to a state of wild health, our original, authentic human animal. And now your hosts, Frank Forensich and Dr. Rodney King.
Ryan.
Hello, hey Rodney.
Hey Ryan, so this is Frank.
Frank, lovely to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, how you doing?
Doing great.
Good.
So man, I'm so excited to talk to you. I'm glad that we finally got and put this together. Right? It's been a while. Yeah. You're like our first guest that we've had that is, what could we call you? An expert in nature connectedness.
Big title, but yeah, all right, I'll take it.
All right, cool. Right. So, yeah. I mean, that's great because I think that's really important. And what I wanted to do, if you don't mind, is, as we've been doing these interviews, in the beginning, we just kind of had this idea, like Frank was like, hey, we should do a podcast and we should kind of talk to people that are interesting because we kind of come from similar idea, from the same ideas, right? So we kind of like see this modern world and we kind of worried where things are going. But I wouldn't say that we had like a thesis or even like a position statement. And so I've been working on one. So I kind of want to read that. And then, you tell me what you think from your perspective. How do you see it?
Interesting.
Because I think that's kind of like a good place to start. And I'm going to just assume that Frank agrees with this. If not, he can say, well, yeah, maybe not, right? Maybe not. But okay, so I'm reading it as if, basically myself and Frank are basically, this is our position statement. All right, so this is what I have, right? The predicament we face is less about individuals failing to adapt and more about a system that mandates adjustment to an inherently unhealthy and unsustainable way of life. We're caught in a vicious cycle, constantly nudged to fit into a mold that is itself damaging and deeply flawed. At the heart of this predicament are insustainable greed, material conquest, hyper-competitiveness at any cost, and unbridled consumerism. To clarify, it isn't science and technology that we contest, but rather the paradigm that governs their application and indeed our broader societal functioning.
Wow.
That's what I have.
Nice. Frank, are you in agreement with that?
Right on the mark. Yes.
Okay. That's
Absolutely.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good. It's interesting. I think I don't think there's anything that I particularly disagree with at all. You kind of bring up for me what really is at the heart of a lot of what I do, but I don't think a lot of people and organizations that reach out to me because they're interested in nature connectedness kind of really realize that actually it's really a counter to a system that we are part of, and it's counter to this rampant consumerism that we just get caught up in, which potentially creates a problem if you're a business and that's what your modus operandi is, right? And that is a big thing, and I think a lot of people don't really appreciate that. It's a real life adjustment. I kind of look at nature connectedness as this kind of counter to this pervading worldview that we are separate, we're superior to the rest of nature. And when you're separate and superior to something, well, you kind of do what you like with it, right? You can exploit it, do whatever you want. No consequence, it doesn't matter because ultimately it is inconsequential to you. It's just a resource to be used. And people don't really appreciate that until they really start to get to grips with it, I think. So yeah, as a position, in terms of going against a system that is inherently broken, probably favors a very select few people overall, does a huge amount of harm and damage to us. I don't think I'm going to pull up any particular points to kind of disagree for sure. But maybe we can kind of explore it as we go. That'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess what I wanted to start with is that, because we're using this term nature connectedness. So maybe that's a good place to start. I mean, how would you define nature connectedness? Is it a sense? Is it a state of mind? A way of life? And how would you define it?
Well, first off, I think it's a really bad kind of term to use, to be honest. Many people have kind of questioned its not necessarily its validity, because I think we're past that stage now in terms of the research, and we can talk about that. But in terms of it being a less than ideal term, a sous-racheur, this kind of imperfect term to describe something, because simply, the very notion that you kind of describe and say, well, we have to reconnect with something goes against what it is. And it is that sensation, as you kind of allude to, Rodney, in terms of you feeling like you belong to something much bigger than you. You are a part of nature, and nature is a part of you. And it's about kind of rediscovering that, because we've lost that sense. We've become disconnected. We've become isolated from the very thing that makes us us. And until we're no longer human beings, however that may happen. If it does, hopefully not. You're always going to be nature. You can't get away from that. And it is that erroneous belief that we are different, we are separate, that we aren't animals, that we aren't these creatures that live in this very delicate, very well balanced world and ecosystem, that fundamentally what happens to it affects us too, and vice versa. So nature connectedness is that sensation, and it is a sensation. Sometimes people kind of see it as this belief, or this kind of cognitive thing, the style that they think of themselves as, I am this. But it goes a lot deeper than that. It really is feeling you are part of something bigger. And for some people, it certainly is a way of life, because it permeates everything about them, who they are, who they identify as, what they do, their behaviors, everything about their life. That's probably when you kind of hit that true nature connectedness, if we're going to keep using that very imperfect term.
Sure.
Ultimately, it is a nature reconnection, I think, is better. But even then, you're still kind of separating. So, yeah, there is a much better term for it out there somewhere, maybe. I don't have it, sadly, and I think it's going to take a bit of kind of getting used to. But as a term, as a way to describe this feeling, I think it's accessible to many people, which is a first start. That's good.
Sure, absolutely. Frank?
Well, I'd like to hear about your research and how that was conducted. Did you take groups of people out into nature, some people not, and so forth? How did that go for you?
Yeah, so I suppose this is kind of a nice little bit segue to what got me interested in it. I've always been quite curious. My aunt, who used to take me out on kind of walks around the neighborhood, living in England, very, very, very suburban life growing up. Gardens, parks, that kind of thing was about it in terms of nature. And I, was just a curious child. And actually, my aunt was always keen to impress upon me as I grew up that actually it was great taking me out on a walk, because you didn't have to go very far, because it would take us, 20, 30 minutes, an hour to just do a few meters, because I was just so curious in seeing where all the little insects are, where and everything else. So I've always had this interest, or I've always had this connection with the wider world, and very active in noticing it, which I think has been really important. And it wasn't until I was at university that I lived with a load of ecology and biology students. They were great. They were really passionate about conservation and protecting the environment, and them going out and doing things that were useful for conservation efforts, that kind of individual behavior, which I thought was great. But my argument was, we need to go beyond that, and actually, as a society, as a world, we need to change the way we are, the way we act, and the things we do. And that really sparked an interest in me. So I wound up doing it as a whole PhD, which is great. And for that, I've always been really quite interested in the method, fitting the design rather than kind of being stuck in one. So I've used a whole range of different methods based on what question I was asking at the time. So I initially started out for the PhD research, especially. I was really, really interested in. Lots of people were adamant that nature and nature connectedness was super important for people feeling good and functioning well, so their well-being. Important, great. some ideas that maybe it might be related to the kind of behaviors that people do. Also, super important for me. One of the, my main motivator, to be honest. But no one had really questioned, how do we reconnect in the first place? Because it was always assumed that you just go outside and you stand in a field, or you walk among some trees, and then therefore instantly light bulb comes on, you are reconnected with nature in this magical, unsubstantiated way. And that really wasn't good enough for me. So I wanted to try and dig deeper into how do people meaningfully reconnect? How does that happen? So I started off asking people who self-reported and said, I'm really highly connected with the natural world. And I asked them, what do they do? So I used focus groups, things like that, to find out. That followed up with some reasonable surveys, 300-400 people roughly, across those, to see what kind of things people were doing and how that correlated, how that related to their levels of nature connectedness when we measure it quantitatively. And then that essentially identified 5 pathways, which was what the pathway framework is, which I suspect we're going to cover in some depth today, which is essentially engaging your senses, emotively, kind of experiencing nature, finding a sense of meaning and purpose, noticing nature's beauty, and ultimately kind of being compassionate, acting compassionately towards nature. They seem to be, according to all that work, and we've gone on and done more since, they were the key pathways to how people actually reconnected. So I tested that experimentally using some kind of guided walks, and that actually showed that it was better than simply just having contact with nature, that it was about these pathways and engaging with nature that way that led to kind of the higher levels of nature connectedness in that. So it's been a real mix, and I've gone on to do kind of other qualitative work, much bigger kind of surveys. Got a whole program of experimental studies being conducted at present. So yeah, it never really stops, which is great. But yeah, it's a real mixed bag in terms of the methodology. But the good thing about it, and it's something that kind of is a present question within science all the time. Psychology is definitely not excluded from this. Is the idea that actually a lot of the time, a lot of the things that we find, we kind of we can't replicate. We can never kind of find it again. It seems to be this momentary one-off thing. And the good news is that the pathways consistently are shown to be really, really important for the nature connectedness that people have. That's great.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, before we get into kind of just digging into that, the pathways, my question is just, based on what you've seen, how have the shifts in our lifestyle and worldview over the past few centuries, how do you see that that's affected our relationship with nature? I think that's really important to situate that before we talk about, okay, this, even though it's not the best term as you noted, how do we reconnect, right? First of all, how has it affected us? So why should we even care?
I think when we talk about nature connectedness, I think for some people, they envisage that what me or other people in the field are talking about is the idea that we need to rewind the clock, kind of go back in time and live a real primitive existence. The fact that there is a massive push towards urban living across the globe, that ain't ever going to happen unless there's some kind of apocalypse that takes out all this tech and everything else. We are not going to regress to that, never. And even then we would. But it isn't really necessarily about that. It's not about rewinding the clock. I think actually it's about creating a new relationship, because for a long time, our relationship with the planet has not necessarily been a very positive one. It has been quite exploitative. And yes, okay, that our kind of improvements in technology, culture, all these kind of things that we possess that makes us to a degree unique. That has been great for people's quality of life. Better access to sanitation, water, food. Less danger from the elements, predators, whatever it might be. It's been great for us. It's been brilliant. So we've always kind of used and tried to innovate within nature itself to survive, and that's a real kind of important characteristic of us as a species. But that has gone too far. We talk about, it being the Anthropocene. Humanity has had such a massive effect that now it's measurable in terms of the changes that we're making to the world. You can't make those kind of changes and not expect a consequence, some kind of kickback, because we've kind of pushed things potentially too far. We see it, loss of species, climate change, whatever it might be. You look at the wildfires raging around Europe. People are now freaking out and saying that actually this is a thing, this is a real issue. So there's definitely physical issues related to that in terms of how we treat the planet, how we act. But also there's aspects of identity, purpose, meaning in life, and we've removed ourselves from it. We're able to talk, across the world right now using this tech. Brilliant, but for some people it becomes an addiction. For some people, screen time dominates, or they just get kind of sucked in because it's designed to fully capture our attention. It's very, very well designed, well created, and that's powerful. But what's the consequence of that to our well-being, our mental health, to our sense of who we are? We kind of lose that. So that whole superiority that I mentioned before, that disconnect, certainly is showing to have some kind of deficit to us. There have been attempts to try and kind of talk about things like nature deficit disorder and things like that. It's not my preferred thing. I don't like pathologizing in that way. I've got many strong opinions on mental health care and other such things, but I don't think it's really a disorder, but it's a useful term because it helps to capture that there is an issue here, or that actually, because of the relationship we have, one that exploits, one that uses without thought, one that consumes without consequence, you can only go so far with that. There's going to be entropy. You cannot constantly keep consuming, keep using, and so we're going to lose things. We are losing all these species in the sixth great mass extinction. What's the consequence of that for us as a species? Many people identify with particular environments, animals, plants, whatever it might be. What happens when we lose that? That ultimately is, I'm very, very on board with E.O. Wilson on this in terms of it being a part of our genetic heritage. You lose that, and you lose a sense of you lose a part of you. And so I think we're only just seeing some of the negative consequences in terms of not only its effect on the planet and our physical safety and security, because ultimately when we talk about saving the world, it doesn't really capture it, because we're saving ourselves. Essentially, we're saving our way of life. The planet will probably get on pretty well without us, to be fair. So actually it is more about saving what we care about. And I think that is a crucial thing, and a lot of it is to do with our way of life. And so we are seeing physical issues, but we're now starting to see mental and well-being ones as well. We know that some of these positive relationships with nature, they not only improve people's mental health, their well-being. That is very, very well established right now in terms of literature base. There's hundreds and hundreds of studies being done showing the same thing over and over again. But we also know that it acts as a protective factor. We know that for adolescents, for example, there's a study done in Canada that showed that levels of adolescents or teenager nature connectedness dropped, but those that actually that their nature connectedness was important as a protective factor against the onset of more serious mental health issues. So we know that it plays a role. And I think the loss of the natural environment, the idea that maybe we are better suited to functioning and are more adapted to more natural settings. And so there are these mismatches within the urban environment that potentially will have an issue for us. There is a whole plethora of things and kind of a negative consequence in terms of we lose a part of us that is really, really important. What happens to us as a result? We change. We are depleted. We are not what we could be.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid base. Frank?
Oh, yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you think. There's been some talk about pulling this into the medical system, and physicians now actually writing what the press is calling green prescriptions.
Yeah.
So you go in to see your doctor and you say, I've got this anxiety or whatever it is. You got one foot in a quagmire of mental health. And the doctor says, okay, here's a prescription to go to the nearest national park. So medicalizing nature. And is that a solution? Is that the right direction?
I think it can be in a way. I think there's a potential danger, and fortunately, I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a doctor here in the UK who's working on creating these kind of nature connectedness based modules for green prescriptions for patients to prescribe them, and essentially to teach general practitioners here, medical doctors, actually the value of it and why it's important, why it's powerful. I think ultimately, and one of the points I made is that you can do some amazing things potentially with nature. You can transform people's lives by immersing them, connecting them, reconnecting them with it. But getting into that stage, you've got a real danger of kind of trivializing our relationship with nature, how we're interacting with it, because it's just seen as this kind of, for want of a better term, people see it as we would call it here hippy dippy type stuff. Very, very kind of tree huggerish, very kind of unsubstantiated, a bit woolly, not necessarily something that they kind of really buy into, and they'll do it, or they'll just laugh it off. They won't be interested. So there is a danger of that, of kind of either making it seem like a joke, which is not going to be great for people's engagement with it and reconnecting. But you can also then, that feeds into the idea that nature is just another resource to be used, and it's there to fix you and nothing else. And I think it ultimately, as I said, it's brilliant to use that kind of stuff, but anything that we do, we need to be focused on helping people meaningfully reconnect with a lost part of them. And if you're not doing that, what's the point? You are trivializing it. So I think it's definitely a useful way forward, because as I was reminded, for a lot of people, they don't necessarily believe what you say. They believe what they experience. And so actually being able to experience that because to be honest with you, if nature is being really, really beneficial for them, for their mental health, well-being, physical health, whatever it might be, probably says that they've been lacking that engagement with it, that reconnection with it in their life. So you are giving them something potentially really, really powerful that can have a huge change for them, and within them. So I definitely see it as a potential area to benefit. I think there are issues where you either trivialize it or it just becomes another resource, and that ultimately is part of the problem. So potentially you are kind of supporting that inadvertently, which happens a lot in terms of anything to do with the nature field, because we are a lot of the time researching it or applying it or coming from this dominant paradigm of the disconnect. So if you're coming at it from that perspective, that disconnect will just run throughout, and it's always going to be about consumption and exploitation as a result.
So on that, Ryan, have you thought about, we were talking about like people perceiving it as being some kind of like tree hugging experience, right?
Yeah.
Have you thought about like, how do you get people to see it differently? Like, how do you convince the average person on the street who is in nowhere near a natural environment?
Yeah.
How do you get them to understand that actually this is really good for them? Have you thought about like that? What would be a strategy would you think would be a good way to go on that? Because like I've even kind of felt that, right? It's kind of, which is interesting. So I'm on the Isle of Man. We have abundant nature, and even trying to get people here to understand what we've been talking about, they don't get it, right? Nature's on their back doorstep, but it's like, yeah, but I go for a walk. But like what you were saying earlier, it's not just about going for a walk, right? It's the intention behind it. So how do you start convincing people that it's more than just a walk in the park, so to speak?
Yeah. we have the same problems here in England, everywhere else. I think a lot of it is to do with noticing. And I think people just don't pay attention to what's around them. When when we are talking about some of my research earlier, a lot of that has not been done in wilderness or areas of pristine natural beauty. We have the areas of natural beauty in the UK, these national parks and things like that. The research wasn't done there; it was done mostly in urban environments. So people were able to reconnect and find those that meaningful relationship wherever they were, which I think is a really important thing to note. My most powerful nature connection experience happened in just opposite where I work, down at Nottingham-on-Trent, and that is a city centre campus. We are smack bang in the middle of the city centre, and so actually, I was there, fed up and tired because it'd been a long day, lots of screen time. Everyone around me, as I was waiting for a tram, were kind of looking at their phones, not paying attention to everything that was around them. I was, because I needed, a release from that. And all of a sudden, I saw a peregrine falcon, so it was a bird of prey, shoot down from the top of the Trent building where they nest, halfway through the year, shot down, and it caught a pigeon mid-flight, maneuvered its way around a lamppost, and flew away. And just the flash of color, the exhilaration that I felt seeing that, and just the awe that I had for that bird surviving in this human-dominated environment, it was fantastic. So many people miss that, and you cannot. Part of the issue that I sometimes have is when I try to create interventions to try and reconnect people. Nature doesn't run on our clocks. I'm reminded of, growing up, I was a big fan of Jurassic Park, which probably explains many things about me. And there's a whole thing of, are you actually going to have dinosaurs on this tour? Because they don't play by our rules. And, anything to do with nature, it doesn't work to our clock when we want it. So we have to be active and seeking these experiences sometimes. And I think you're right. I think there's very much an issue in terms of, for certain groups, the message and the way it's framed is not good. It switches people off. Part of that is because, to be honest with you, in the UK, lots of places right now, cost of living crisis, people are struggling to make ends meet. They won't give a damn about nature at that point because they're literally trying to survive. What importance does it have for me right now when I'm trying to feed my family, or get a better job, or whatever it might be? And so actually the way that sometimes we message and frame it all is done, to be honest, quite terribly. A lot of the time in our research, and colleagues and peers and others do, the people that they include within their studies, and it's happened to me, you are essentially working with people who are already invested, who are already converted, who already know that nature is positive for them. And that's the issue. Nature connection research tends to attract females and those with a reasonable high level of nature connection already. Generally, kind of middle-aged. They aren't necessarily the people that we need to reconnect with, because we know that actually for teenagers, we have this notion of a teenage dip. The level of nature connection kind of goes reasonably high in childhood, and then it dips right down in adolescence. And it takes till about your 30s, 40s for it to recover to where it was when you were a kid. So we know that actually it's a protective factor, but we know that it drops massively. Lots of reasons for that, but potentially that is an issue.
What would some of the reasons be for that, Ryan? Like, why would that happen, do you think?
I mean, puberty is a massive thing, of course.
Sure.
Massive changes. But I think there are other things. There's a lot of pressure in terms of, academic achievement at that time. Your interests are changing, your sense of self, your identity is shifting. So there are certainly changes. But then I've come across projects where they've engaged young people in really powerful, meaningful ways, having skaters document the nature that is around them, and they start to reconnect with the areas around their skate parks and the places where they skate, and they make a mini documentary about it. It was really, really quite moving. So
I think that's super powerful though, right? So maybe what you're saying there that's really important is that people need to be a little bit more innovative and creative with their ideas. And rather than trying to change people per se, is finding what they already do and then using that as the base to get them to quote unquote reconnect with the natural world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's partly my approach has always been, we've just got to, you don't necessarily have to change what you do, you just have to make sure it's focused in the right way. So that the pathways that I created through my research that I mentioned earlier, they are a framework. They're not a prescriptive thing. It's not like you have to do this particular activity if you want to reconnect with nature. Actually, what it really is a framework that can be adapted and take existing things people do already and actually just reframe, refocus. So if you weren't using your senses before when you're gardening, smell the flower whilst you're doing it. Or, when you're out walking, touch the bark of a tree, to just start to ground yourself, feel something different.
So this would be a really good point, like for you to kind of outline what that framework is so that people know what it is.
So essentially the Pathways framework came out of my PhD. So all those studies that I briefly mentioned earlier was all about how do we meaningfully reconnect people. And eventually we identified 5 particular, they're essentially value-informed ways of reconnecting that seemed to be at the time, and we've gone on to show that, yes, they definitely are. They are some of the most powerful ways to reconnect. And in some ways, it kind of taps into just how people form meaningful relationships with the world around them anyway. That's ultimately what it is as well. It's about that relationship you have. So essentially, they are, engaging with your senses, emotively connecting, finding meaning, purpose, acting compassionately, and appreciating beauty. Now, these pathways themselves, we've used them across the world. There's lots of organisations that have adapted them and have adopted them for their own purposes. In the UK, the National Trust have been a real big pioneer in this. They use them across their sites to reconnect people in outdoor-based activities. Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, they use it in some of their conservation work to re-engage people, but also at their sites, they've got a massive zoo/conservation set up in Jersey, and they have a butterfly house based around pathways of beauty, for example. They really, really tap into it. So it gets used in forest bathing practice and all sorts of different places. The pathways themselves are really good because you can take, say, I don't know, a citizen science activity where you're just doing a moth count or an insect count or something like that. And actually you can still do that, which is great, but actually just noting down the quantity of an insect probably isn't going to reconnect you. But if you start to, appreciate how beautiful the moth is in terms of its patterns, the softness of its wings, maybe, you start to reflect on the role that moth plays within the wider world, and you can kind of start to relate to it and value it just for being a moth. You're finding a bit of meaning, purpose in it, and in yourself, whatever it might be. You can do that whilst you are counting insects, and then you get a much more powerful reconnection with that particular species. So the framework can be adapted and adjusted to suit whatever activity you're doing, because as long as you are noticing and you're engaging in a meaningful way, rather than it just being this passive thing that you do, which kind of goes back to Frank's point about green prescriptions. For a lot of people, they'll be given a task, go walking in nature. They'll do it, they'll rush through, headphones in, whatever else, phone, whatever it might be. They're not going to meaningfully reconnect. But actually, if you are taking the time actively to use these pathways, you're going to start to relate to the world around you. That's really, really important.
We probably can also make the argument that unless they're connecting meaningfully in the way that you're describing, the health benefits are not going to arise for them anyway.
Probably not. I mean, you'll get physical health benefits from moving more, but we know that actually nature connectedness is probably not as important for physical health. It's about the activity you're doing, physicality. For your well-being, massively important compared to simple contact. So yeah, if you're not getting that meaningful reconnection, your sense of meaning and purpose, your joy, your vitality, whatever it might be, you're not going to get that. And I think going back to your point, Rodney, about the issue in terms of how do we get the real engaged people, when we do get them, we know that they benefit tremendously you see huge spikes in the outcomes in their from nature connectedness, shoots right up, but also their well-being, their mental health, etc. All these benefits go right up too. So actually, those that need it the most probably benefit the most, but they are the least engaged. And I could say, oh, why don't you be more compassionate in nature? Loads of people switch off and tell them to go do one, go away, whatever. It's crazy. I'm not interested in that. It's all soft and woolly and horrible. It just doesn't work. And I think part of the issue that we have is that we are preaching to the converted, so to speak, to some degree, and there are lots of organizations that look at the breakdown as to where people sit in terms of their values, their priorities, things like that. So there's a really good group called Cultural Dynamics that do lots of work on the various different sections of society and where people sit. And they have three kind of broad classifications for people. The first is those that are kind of seeking security, safety. You have those that are very interested in new experiences, boosting their well-being, all that kind of stuff. And then you have people that are very focused on their kind of moral development, thinking about kind of these moralistic arguments, their place in the world, all that kind of stuff. A bit more philosophical. Nature connectedness really taps into those that are interested in philosophy and also a moral stance in terms of what are we doing to the planet? How can we better protect it? How can I be a better me? That kind of thing. It also, because of the well-being angle, taps very much into new experiences for people, improving their well-being, all that kind of stuff. So we know that those two broad kind of classifications of people, it speaks to, and it's very easy to frame your arguments around that, and you can get them involved. So if they were given a green prescription, or they were just enticed to do some pathways-based interventions, they'd be all up for it because they could see the value for them for what's really interesting for them. For those that are probably in the kind of safety security mindset, it's not going to be there, And if we talk about nature, a lot of the time, people when they're really passionate about it, they talk about the need to save species, the need to reduce climate change, all this kind of stuff. That will not fly for them because it probably means they will see it as loss of jobs, loss of opportunity, and actually they've got much bigger things to focus on right now.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, as you were saying that, I was just thinking about I guess, so one way to try to shift the needle, so to speak, is to, first of all, find ways for people to reconnect in their environment, wherever they happen to be. And I like the fact that you said it doesn't have to be, outside in the countryside. Also to make it that it doesn't cost anything, right? That it's not going to cost them anything. Because if people are, I'm assuming that in that kind of quadrant of the survival kind of space that people are in, there are going to be some people that are tipping over to the next tier, right?
Yeah.
And I guess that's where some work could actually be very successful. With those people, if you could get them to do it in the environment that they find themselves, do it in such a way that it's not going to cost them anything, you might be able to convert some of those people over to being more in line with or open to reconnecting with nature. And I would think also you'd need to be quite careful, because I know the demographic you're talking about, you would have to be quite careful on how you situate that, how you write about it, how you present it, right? Because if it comes across too flowery, you've lost them.
Yeah.
And, that's not their fault per se. It's just that, the place where they are and the societal pressures that are pressed upon them naturally makes people that way.
Exactly. And, your initial thesis at the beginning talked about the broken system and the pressures that puts on people and, all the expectations, the requirements that people have in their life. In some ways we've become so removed from this natural world to which we belong that it doesn't impact them directly, or at least it won't for quite a while, until probably it is too late. It isn't going to really be an easy fix to reconnect them, to solve well-being, mental health issues, whatever it might be. And so, removing some of that, even the framing of some of these pathways that I developed when we were thinking about some of the phrases, the terms to use, when I've worked with organizations that talk about messaging, framing, etc., they were like, you got to be careful with compassion because it switches people off. Even that is deemed really, really flowery. So sometimes you have to try and think around and find better ways of articulating things. And ultimately, yeah, I agree. It isn't their fault because they have so many pressures, so many things coming out. What do they care about? Some scientist guy coming around and telling them they should be doing this differently. Yeah, okay. I come from a working class family. I know what it's like to kind of struggle to survive. But I'm in a very privileged position right now, and where I work, what I do, etc. So finding ways to really help engage people like that, I think is difficult, but it isn't impossible. And I think part of it is, as you say, getting people when they're kind of tipping over into the next kind of sphere of interest is an easier task. I think having particular figures, notable community leaders, whatever it might be, to show the benefit of that, I think is potentially a really powerful way to go, because it's very easy for us to come at it from an outsider, and one of the things that I'm always conscious of is that a lot of the nature connectedness research is very Western dominated. That's a big problem, and maybe we'll talk about that if we have time. There are issues there in terms of this insider outsider perspective, and so actually reaching people where they're at, framing it to make it both see a reason for them to do it in terms of not necessarily always benefit, but a reason for it, an outcome or a way of making it resonate with them, I think is really key. And we might not always do that. And when we try and do that, we need to think about how we do communicate, because people who engage in research, whether it's arts-based, science-based, bit of both, can be terrible at kind of communicating things. So actually finding a better way to do that, being mindful of it, I think is really, really key. And there are people pushing for that kind of thing. But I think ultimately, until all those sections of society that I mentioned earlier, nature connectedness becomes kind of the norm, just a normal everyday thing. It's going to be very, very difficult. And that's one thing that I should impress, is that a lot of the research that I've done and others have done, time doesn't really matter. And so it isn't even a question of, oh, I've got to spend hours and hours a day going out, engaging with nature, connecting with it meaningfully. Time really isn't important. It's what you do that really counts.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah, and even those kind of small kind of things, those little everyday activities that people can do, takes 5 minutes, 2 minutes at a time. It's about having the mindset and being open to it and having that ingrained within you. It's just a habitual thing that you do. When I go outside, I actively notice, I can't help it. I'm curious, I'm interested. I'm fortunate to have that. Training people, helping them to be like that, just as a normal thing, I think is probably one of the best ways, because ultimately if they experience the positives, they experience that awe, that reconnection, that sense of joy, meaning, whatever it might be, that's probably how you really get them.
That's really good. Yeah. Frank?
Yes, well, I'm interested in sort of, you might say, the next step, or what happens if we actually succeed at this stuff. I'm sure you're familiar with Aldo Leopold and his famous passage is that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds.
Yeah.
And that's what happens for me personally, because I go out in nature. The popular press is saying, oh, you're going to have all these benefits from being in nature. You're going to feel less anxiety. Your body's going to work better, da, 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 da. But what happens to me is that comes, and then the thing that comes next is the anger and the rage and the bitterness of seeing what we're doing to it. And people aren't talking about that. I mean, I get furious when I see the extent of the damage. And that's precisely because I've had that experience of being connected. So what's your take on all that?
Yeah. So again, there's another kind of push in some areas of research where they pathologize it again. They call it eco-anxiety. This idea that you are anxious about the state of the planet, the harm that's being caused, and everything else. To be fair, I do have some issues with anxiety in terms of it as a diagnosis, anyway, because I think a lot of the time people are acting rationally to things that are going on. And yes, sometimes it can be imagined, whatever else, but their response is justified. And I think when you pathologize that, it doesn't really, really work as well, because you're turning something that is a normal reaction into something that is abnormal. And so, when it comes to eco anxiety in particular, I feel it too. I totally get why people get really anxious about the future state of things. There's been a lot of research that has been done under that umbrella, and it's interesting. You see that younger generations who kind of talk about eco anxiety or start to kind of speak about it, and this seems to be universal. I was working with students from Yonsei University in Korea, as part of like an exchange program, and speaking to some of the professors there, they were talking about a real shift in terms of the generations, where there's real anger from younger generation. I think they call it Generation Alpha. This generation who are angry. They're really fed up, and I could use many expletives about the way that the world is now, and that the adults around them seem to not care and don't want to do anything about it. They just let it burn. They've let it rot. And it's the same here. It's the same all over the world. Yeah, we know that in some respects, adolescent levels of their connection with nature, their relationship drops. Doesn't mean that a lot of them don't care, and they really, really do. It really directly affects them. So they are angry about it, and they feel as though they're just being sold at the river, so to speak, because they have no power to do anything about it, but they're the ones that it's going to impact the most. And I think the whole idea of being angry and feeling the pain of what's happening to the planet around us is a legitimate thing. That's ultimately it is a consequence of our relationship that we have. And this is why when people talk about, nature connectedness, it's this kind of, some people see it as a silver bullet that will fix so many problems for people. And I have to say, no, it doesn't always. Because what you're dealing with is one of the most powerful forces that humanity has. And that's our ability to form meaningful relationships with human and non-human entities alike. We are social creatures, and it drives so much of our behavior, has a massive impact on us. And so there is a dark side to nature connectedness, so to speak. And this is one of them. The idea that actually higher levels of nature connection, and they have shown this, leads to higher levels of anxiety and fear about what's going to happen to the planet. They've shown that, and it was an underreported study. I'll have to dig out the reference, but essentially they found that if your relationship is about kind of feeling better about yourself, improving your well-being, that's what your nature connectedness is for. Nature connectedness is great. The higher the level, the better it is for you. Where your relationship is based on a real meaningful sense of place and relationship with the world around you, that's what it's all about, rather than a benefit for you per se. That's where your high levels of fear and worry about the future come in. And it really is something that I don't think researchers really acknowledge enough, because we do go, and it's a bit ties again into this green prescription thing. Potentially, you're getting people more engaged and reconnected with the world around them. For some people, hopefully, they will meaningfully reconnect, and they will foster a real strong sense of relationship with the world around them. If that is related to trees or whatever in their local area that then get cut down as a result of council planning or damage to property, whatever else, that's going to cause issues for them that maybe we didn't originally intend to happen. So actually, you are unleashing quite a potentially strong force in nature connectedness, that there are consequences if you are seen as quite high, if we measure it quantitatively, in terms of you will be a lot more open and prone to real potential despair, anger, frustration because of the state of the planet, because ultimately you actually have realized this kind of real sense of you and nature being one and the same. So if you chop down a tree, it's like taking off a limb, all that kind of thing. And Aldo Leopold really is kind of one of the forefathers of nature connectedness. It was his work that actually inspired really the field, especially within psychology in particular, where it's come to today. So actually not recognizing the consequence, that dark side, if you want to call it that, of nature connectedness is something that we do need to acknowledge. And how you fix that, we don't know. The only thing I've ever come across in the literature is the idea, as you say, Frank, you get angry about it. For some people, that is the only way to actually deal with it positively, because anger can then lead to action to then feel like actually you are making a difference, you are doing something. But for many people, it can simply be despair and heartbreak.
Yeah, so as we come to the top of the hour here, Frank, anything else? I don't want to keep Ryan longer than we need to.
I just had a quick thing, and that's have you noticed that some of these recent protest marches, some of the banners that people are holding up that say, "We are nature defending herself." And I just find that breathtaking, because that is the ultimate identification with nature. Saying we are nature, we aren't outside of nature, we are nature fighting back for our own survival. And for me, that is just incredibly inspiring. So
yeah, and actually I think that really cuts the heart of it. That the true reconnection with that lost part of you is that you are nature and nature is you. We're currently trialing some interventions that really focus on that, the identifying with not only with nature but as being nature, and using character strengths and other such things to really tap into that seems quite effective. So I think actually as a way of exemplifying that, putting it across, I think that is ultimately the crux of what nature connectedness is. Going, okay, this is me, and I'm fighting back against a real physical threat to me and me extended in terms of the natural world.
Yeah. That's really great, Ryan. So I want to respect your time. I just got one more thing, just one little thing. If memory serves me correct, isn't there an online course that people can do with the pathways? I mean, which is it not the University of Derby? Is that where it's on?
Yeah, that's right. So now I don't know, because I moved on from Derby in 20.
I think it's still there. It's a free course, right? It's a free course.
Yeah, so it's a massive open online course.
Yes, there we go.
On nature connectedness. So I helped write that with Miles Richardson and Holly-Ann Passmore, my colleagues. So it is available online for free. You can take it. I think Derby did turn it into some kind of monetized thing elsewhere. So I don't know whether that's a different version or extended, but the one that I worked on was still based at Derby. So yeah, it's a free course. It talks about nature connectedness, the pathways, the research involved, how you measure it. If you're really interested in doing work using nature connectedness and trying to help meaningfully reconnect people, there is a module based on how you can actually do it and assess it and see whether actually it's made a difference or not. So yeah, there is a I don't have the website to hand, but
I'll go and find it. I'll find it and I'll
it.
stick the link underneath the video. So for anybody that's interested, they can go and do the course.
Do it for free. Yeah, why not? Yeah,
cool.
And I think actually opportunity, as you mentioned before, having things that are just open, because it shouldn't. People have to make a living, I appreciate, but this is potentially really radical stuff because it goes against a lot of things, whether it's institutions and systems that really oppress and damage people, or also giving people a new lease on a life that they didn't even know that they had.
No, I love it, man. That's fantastic. Well, Ryan, that was amazing. I hope we can do it again, because I definitely feel there's a second part here for sure. So I'm going to let you go, but thanks for the time, and then I'll let you know when it's up.
Brilliant. Love to meet you, Frank. Cheers, Ronnie.
Hey, good to meet you, man.
Good to
Thanks,
see you,
Ryan.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hey.
Cool. So what did you think?
Great.
So Ryan was my MSc supervisor for my Masters in Nature Connectedness under the rubric of health psychology at De Montfort University. He's not there anymore. He's at Nottingham Trent, but he was my main supervisor.
Right.
That's the connection. And, as you can see, very knowledgeable, an amazing supervisor because he just, lives and breathes it. And really great person to kind of had steered my research and, super thankful. And what he did for me was amazing because he left De Montfort University to go to a new job and he didn't have to, and he stayed on as my supervisor. So that was really great. I appreciate that. Hey, Dr. King here. Thank you for joining myself and Frank on an exploration in improving the health of the human animal. To find out more about our work, you can visit Frank at exuberantanimal.com. For coaching with me, gear, and to find out more about the Human Animal Project, as well as my retreats, go to drrodneyking.com. Until next time, be wild, be free.